I'll have a question for Scott. And how Global Compact could be a very nice way to serve and offer ways to use it, ways to do it, and so on. And this SDG 17 could be an inspiration for this question.
Mm-hmm. Shall I start? Good.
Yes.
So first of all, I think UN Global Compact is a collection of interesting partners that is already working on the SDG goals, and that gives a natural starting point. I think what we try to do currently, and we have already gathered a couple of companies where we would like to put our standard that we have created on an open source platform jointly, because we believe it has to be in a supranational institution one day. I think the biggest sunk cost over time is if we have competition on methodology. I'm generally pro competition, but maybe not on methodology.
And sustainability.
And that's one area for collaboration for sure, because everyone who has an advancement needs to open up so that we can learn from each other. And we are also far from being perfect. Let's mention that very clearly. But there's another area which I would like to mention that goes into politics. Let me just give you a little bit of a frame what the challenges really are, because it's easy to talk about, circular economy and all these kind of elements, but we do not only need standards on the collaboration of methodologies and acting upon it, we also need the framework for it. We heard before the CO2 pricing, for example.
Exactly.
It differs country by country. We have 100,000 data where we have country coefficients, and then we have different pricing everywhere. And this level playing field issue is very important. If you want to implement sustainability on a wider global framework, it would actually need a joint agreement of G20, which these days will be extremely difficult to pursue, or bilateral agreements, just to name one. Second example, take waste management. We recently made a study across various countries. Every single country has a different waste legislation. It would not work even if we wanted to implement a waste, framework for circular economy, because this needs core elements that are repetitive, and we are a global player. We are not just active in one country. So that's the second area where we need more collaboration. And the third one is what we saw when we used the data for action. I think we had a lot of learnings. If you, for example, looked at investments that we have done, we had one example where we wanted to decide, do we want to invest in Poland or in China? The data, and that was unique, hinted that, for example, in China, in the case of China, there was a water-stressed area. And if you look at the total value of everything, it turned out to be less beneficial for society or for an investment than an investment in Poland. So what I'm trying to say, this tool is not about it's about reporting, it's about action in the end and how to implement it, because investors need that transparency of why have companies taken what kind of decisions. And that's, for me, the third area of collaboration. The investment, the investment community needs to be part of that process, and I already invited you, right?
Very much agree with that, and that collaboration can't report on that because there's no
reaching the SDGs is about cooperation. There's absolutely no way you take any of them that any single company, investor, government, NGO can believe that they will succeed on their own addressing this. So we absolutely need a framework, many thousands of frameworks of collaboration. It's about collaboration and collective success. Yet, I fully agree with what Scott just said. Let me just give you one example. I was talking about CO2. 10 years ago, we started to say we need to measure our CO2 in order to make sure that we incentivize our people about it. So we had some of us were saying, well, let's make studies and make sure that we understand how that works, and the scope 1, 2, 3 and everything else. And Laura, who's here, was already part of that story. And the COMEX members of Danone said, well, let's start with 5% of CO2 in the bonus, because until we're sure about the numbers. And some of us said, no, guys, we don't want to throw money out of the window, so we will make CO2 30% of everyone's bonus. And because this is 30%, I'm sure that by the end of the year, you will find a way to have the metrics, because you just don't want to throw that money out of the window. And guess what? 10 years later, on Scope 2, we've divided CO2 footprint by 2. But only because we decided to go big in terms of the impact on people. We put our money where our mouth was, in the symbolic of where the bonuses of people were. And it came to the point where we finally co-developed with SAP, a special module of the SAP platform that became the FMCG module for calculation of CO2. That's how far it went. But this is simply to say that I fully agree we need to move. But not only fixing a global reporting that is about SDGs is fundamental, and I do believe that UNGC provides a great platform to do this. We need to harmonize with GRI. For us, we need to harmonize with B Corp. B Corp has a great standard of indicators, but we need them to align with SDGs, with our industries, etc. But we need people to be incentivized on the same. So, for instance, on CO2, I would dream to see one day investors incentivized on the CO2 performance of their portfolio. I've not seen that. Maybe that exists. I hope it does. Because, of course, this will not be perfect, because no one is measuring, BASF is probably not measuring the CO2 exactly the same way we do. But yes, I agree with Scott that ultimately sustainability drives performance from a financial standpoint. But I think it would be a radically different proof in the cake if investors were incentivized on the CO2 of their portfolio, not only the integrated performance that comes from the CO2 performance into the share price. That day, we would have a mirror in the investor community and the business community looking for financial performance, social performance, environmental performance, etc., which at the end creates the SDG performance. So this is where I think the more we will refine the indicators, provided we are clear that we are ready to put our money where our mouth is, and the more we'll be able to have a fluid dialogue and therefore value at the end of the day.
I would like to build, Emmanuel, on what you said on the CO2 pricing. I think where we are all jointly in one boat is we're entering a new age whereby the CO2 pricing not only becomes true cost inside the company, that's at least what we are looking at, but it also will lead to very, very clear decision that we have to take in future. For example, when we do portfolio moves or when we do investments. We just recently had one decision that we announced that we will invest in a big plant in China. But when we were asked based on what kind of raw material, we clearly stated it's based on renewable. So that is one of the fundamental things that will really change in future going forward, because we cannot afford, to go on as in the past, just, build without taking ownership or whatever. So this is something where I think we are united, that in that sense, CO2, as one example, will lead to much more dramatic thinking of how do we actually do it in future.
I think regarding climate change, CO2 and prices could be certainly will be a very strong movement leading by many actors, and regarding investors, regarding companies, a place that we should move on. And we have more than 70 places, like states, governors, and city, that are measuring and getting price in CO2. And I think it's regarding scale, you cannot manage different price in different place. You have to start to have more market to price it. An externality could be part of the internal cost of capital. That's the challenge. Scott, for you, PRI, GRI, UNEP-FI, and Global Compact are working together in many initiatives, positive impact, task force for related impact, and they recently launched a new report called In Focus, addressing investors' needs in business reporting on SDGs. This report offers a guidance to report and represents in some ways the necessities, the needs of the investors to move more faster, more quickly, to investing in companies and in businesses that we are dealing with these issues like climate change, SDGs, impact, human rights. Do you think it's an advance?
It's definitely an advance.
Yes,
and,
I think so.
Now, we realize that for a lot of companies, it's too ambitious to expect, the full complement of measurements to come out really quickly. It's one of the reasons we really like the idea of SDG bonds and why we keep going back to that, because almost any company can at least carve out some portion of the business that they're pretty clear on, that they're either addressing a risk or an opportunity with respect to SDGs. Now, there might be a lot of gray area around it, but they can at least carve out that first piece and report on it. And so, we think that for a lot of companies might be a stepping stone where they say, okay, we understand it. We have investors that want to know, they want to invest that way. I mean, we have a lot of investors that say, look, we have a large amount of money to deploy. The problem is we can't find the vehicle to do it. We can't find a way that's easy enough for us to get our money invested where we know and can measure the impact that we're having. So once again, the SDG bonds are sort of the answer to this chicken and egg problem, where a lot of big companies don't feel like they can do a good job of disclosing everything or measuring everything. So once again, they should take a bite-sized chunk and think about issuing an SDG bond. And you've got a large group of investors who want to deploy a huge amount of money, but right now they have a fairly limited opportunity set because there's only been a handful of companies that have given them an investment vehicle that's really focused.